The morning mist sat low over the valley the way it always had, the way it had for 10,000 years before the first satellite ever blinked into orbit, and Thomas Reed stood at his kitchen window watching it and thinking about nothing in particular, which was one of the great luxuries of being 94 years old with nowhere to be. He had boiled water on the stove. Not synthesized, not assembled molecule by some quiet domestic unit humming in a wall. He had filled a kettle from the tap, and set it on the gas burner, and turned the knob, and waited for the sound, that low, building murmur that his grandmother had called the kettle singing. He waited for that sound every morning the way some people waited for prayer. It meant the day had started. It meant he was still here. The house was small by any standard, in any century. 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a kitchen that looked out over a half-acre garden where tomatoes grew in summer and Brussels sprouts survived into October, and the roses, 3 of them, all climbers, all red, had wrapped themselves around the porch posts so completely that some years you couldn't find the wood beneath them at all. The floors were original pine, scarred and pale and warm underfoot. The windows were old enough that the glass had developed a faint waviness, so the outside world appeared to tremble slightly in the morning light, like a reflection in disturbed water. Thomas had lived here for 61 years. He had carried his wife across the threshold in 2539, when the house was still a ruin and they were both young enough to find that romantic rather than frightening. He had buried her in the garden in 2571, beneath the roses, in a wooden box he had built himself from timber he had milled from a tree that fell in the woods at the property's edge. He had lowered her into the earth with his own hands. There had been no one else to help. There had been no one else, full stop, for quite some time by then. The kettle sang. He poured water over the loose-leaf tea in the ceramic pot, a pot made by a woman in what had once been Wales, 300 years ago, sold at an estate auction that he had attended at the age of 31 with his father, who had pressed it into his hands and said, "Take care of that, boy, it's older than anything you've ever touched," and he carried the pot and a single cup to the table by the window and sat down. Outside, the garden was just beginning to show its autumn colors. The tomato plants were finished and drooping, waiting to be pulled. The roses had given their last flush of the season. Everything was in the process of becoming something quieter. He was not a melancholy man. That is important to understand about Thomas Reed. He was not sitting in that kitchen mourning his life or grieving his solitude or performing some private ritual of grief. He was simply sitting, the way a stone sits, present, settled, real. He poured his tea. He drank it while it was hot, the way his father had taught him. He was thinking about the visitor who was coming. The shuttle arrived at 11 in the morning, which Thomas considered an unreasonable hour for a first meeting, too late to catch a person at their best, too early to offer lunch without it feeling forced. He had nonetheless put on a clean shirt. It was a flannel shirt, dark green, worn soft over many years. He had combed his white hair with water at the bathroom mirror and looked at himself without judgment or pride, which was also one of the great luxuries available to the very old. He stood on the porch when the shuttle descended. It came down in the meadow beyond his fence, silent as falling leaves. The Galactic Union ran everything on what Sera's people called harmonic displacement, which produced no sound and no heat signature and left no mark on the grass. Thomas had once read that the Union's transportation engineers had spent 40 years specifically trying to engineer away all sensory evidence of their machines, because many of the species in the Union experienced loud or hot or disruptive technology as a form of aggression. He found this both admirable and faintly comic. His people had spent centuries building things that announced themselves. A figure emerged from the shuttle and walked toward the fence. She was young. He could see that from a distance, the particular quality of movement that belongs only to young bodies, everything fluid and unguarded. She was dressed practically, dark trousers, a jacket the grey-green of old lichen, hair pulled back from a face that was, he could see as she came closer, composed in an expression of professional neutrality that did not quite conceal something more uncertain underneath. She was half-human, which was evident to him not because she looked substantially different from anyone he might have met in his youth, but because of certain small things, the slight luminescence at her temples, which indicated Velthari ancestry, one of the Union's elder species, bioluminescent in their emotional centers, and the elongated structure of her fingers, which suggested Ashari lineage somewhere, a species that had evolved in low gravity and consequently had hands built for delicate and precise manipulation. She was, in other words, a person assembled from several histories. Which, Thomas reflected, was what most people were now. He opened the gate before she reached it. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Thomas," he said. "Nobody's called me Mr. Reed in 40 years, and even then I thought they were talking about my father. Come in out of the damp." She introduced herself as Sera Van, cultural archivist, 3rd classification, assigned to the Bureau of Species Documentation. She said this with the slight formality of someone reciting credentials they have learned to produce immediately, to get the official part over with so the human part can begin. "I know what you're here for," Thomas said. "Come have some tea." She sat at the kitchen table, his kitchen table, 400 years old, scored with knife marks and water rings and a burn in one corner from a candle that had been left too long, and held the cup he gave her with both hands, in the way that people do when they're cold or nervous, using warmth as something to hold on to. "You've reviewed the documentation," she said. "I've reviewed the letter," he said. "I don't have documentation. I have a letter. There's a difference." She conceded this with a small nod. The letter from the Bureau. It said the Union intends to formally classify Homo sapiens, the culturally distinct variant, they called it, which I thought was very diplomatic, as extinct. Pending final assessment. "That's correct. And you're the final assessment." "I'm part of it, yes. I have 7 days to compile a comprehensive record of your," she paused, searching for the word that would be accurate without being brutal. She did not find it. "Of what you preserve here. Your practices. Your knowledge. The way you live." Thomas looked at her for a moment. He had the steady gaze of someone who had spent 6 decades with no one to look at but himself and the sky, and it did not make people comfortable, that gaze, though it was not unkind. It was simply unafraid of duration. "The way I live," he said. "Yes." "All right." He refilled her cup without asking. "Then I suppose we'd better start." The first day, he showed her the garden. He did not describe it to her. He did not offer context or historical framework or cultural significance. He put on his boots, leather, laced, repaired so many times that almost nothing original remained except the shape, and he led her through the gate and into the beds, and he moved through the garden the way he always did, stopping when something required attention, checking things with his hands, running his thumb along the underside of a tomato leaf to check for the curl that meant drought stress, squeezing a Brussels sprout to test its tightness, pinching back a rose cane that had grown too long. Sera followed with her recording equipment, a small device at her collar that captured everything: sound, image, atmospheric data, biological signatures. She had explained its function and he had said that was fine. "Record whatever you like, I'm not performing anything." "What made you choose this?" she asked, after a long silence in which he had knelt in the mud to examine the root structure of a failing tomato plant and she had watched. "Gardening. All of it. The house. The garden. Living this way." He sat back on his heels. The mud was cold and he could feel it through his trousers, and he was glad, in a low-grade way that he didn't examine too closely, that he could still feel it. "My father gardened. His mother gardened. It goes back as far as I can trace, on both sides. When you live somewhere for generations, you develop a relationship with that particular piece of ground. You learn what it wants, what it needs. My grandmother used to say that good gardeners don't grow things, they only make the conditions for things to grow. I think about that a lot." "Do you find it lonely?" Sera asked. She asked carefully, like someone who has been trained to ask the question and is trying to sound like they haven't been. Thomas pulled the failing plant from the earth. The roots came up with it, pale and tangled, smelling of soil in the particular way that, he had read somewhere, a long time ago, triggers something in the human olfactory system that is neurologically linked to comfort, to safety, to the sensation of being home. He brought it to his face and inhaled. "I've been lonely," he said. "I know what loneliness is. This isn't it. Loneliness is when you're with people who don't know you. I've been alone long enough that I know myself very well. That's different." Sera wrote something in the notebook she kept alongside the recorder. He noticed that she wrote by hand, and he didn't comment on it, but he noticed. In the evenings, after supper, they sat by the fire. This was something Thomas had done every night of his adult life that circumstances permitted. Not a synthesized flame, not a light that mimicked warmth, a real fire, built from split wood that he had stacked in the barn and carried in armloads to the basket by the hearth. The building of the fire was a small ceremony he performed with the same precise series of actions each time. Paper first, then kindling, thin strips of cedar that he split himself, then the larger logs arranged in a configuration he had learned from his father, who had learned from his, who had learned it in a world that Thomas could only barely imagine. Sera sat in the armchair that had been his wife's chair. He had not pointed that out. He had simply watched her choose it, something in the quality of its placement near the window, angled slightly toward both the fire and the view, and thought that Margaret would have liked this young woman, with her careful questions and her handwritten notes and the way she held things, both objects and silences, with a quality of attention that felt rare. "Tell me about her," Sera said, on the second evening. He looked up. He had not mentioned Margaret. "There are photographs," Sera said simply. "Everywhere." He looked around the room as though seeing it fresh. She was right. There were photographs on every surface, framed, propped, pinned to the mantelpiece. Margaret at 30, in the garden of her parents' house, laughing at something outside the frame. Margaret at 50, standing in the doorway of this very house, squinting into winter light. Margaret at 67, 3 years before she died, sitting in this chair, this very chair, with a book open on her lap and reading glasses pushed up on her head and the expression she always wore when she'd been interrupted mid-thought, faintly amused, fully present. She was a botanist, Thomas said. That was her work, though she never used the word work about it. She said calling it work was like calling breathing a chore. She was more interested in plants than in people, which I always thought was one of her great virtues. He paused. She was also funnier than anyone I have ever known. I don't know if that comes through in the photographs. It might, Sera said, looking at the one on the mantelpiece. She looks like she's about to say something. She usually was. He stared at the fire. She died in the garden. That was, well, that was right. She would have wanted that. To have the earth under her hands at the end. She used to say the garden was the only place she could think clearly, and I always took that slightly personally, but she was right. There's something about contact with growing things. It keeps you honest. Sera was quiet. The fire crackled and shifted. "Do you miss her every day?" she asked. "Every hour," he said. "But not the way you might think. Not painfully, mostly. More the way you'd miss a limb. Not constantly agonizing, just a permanent change in how you move through the world. You adapt. But you always know something's different." She wrote in her notebook. He watched the fire. Outside, the autumn wind pushed through the rose canes against the porch, a soft, irregular tapping, like someone politely knocking. On the third day it rained and they stayed inside and he taught her to make bread. This had not been planned. She had come into the kitchen in the morning to find him already up, flour on the counter, and she had stood in the doorway for a moment watching, and he had said, without looking up, "Don't just stand there, wash your hands." There was something in the instruction, its directness, its assumption that she would simply comply, that she responded to. She washed her hands at the sink. He showed her how to measure flour by weight rather than volume, which he explained produced more consistent results, and she said she didn't know there was a difference, and he said most people didn't, and that was part of the problem. He showed her how to make a well in the flour, how to add the yeast dissolved in water that was warm but not hot, and this was a thing that required judgment rather than measurement. You had to feel the water against your wrist, the way temperature was assessed before thermometers were ubiquitous, and how to combine the ingredients in the specific sequence that encouraged the gluten to develop properly. He talked throughout, not lecturing, but narrating, the way you talk when you're doing something familiar and want someone to follow along. She was not a natural. Her hands were too hesitant at first, too careful, and the dough knew it. Dough is extraordinarily sensitive to intention, Thomas had always believed, though he knew this was probably not scientifically defensible, and came together lumpy and reluctant. He put his hands over hers and guided them. The old gesture of instruction that human beings have made since the first fire was shown to the first child, and she felt the difference immediately, the rhythm of it, the push and fold and turn. "There," he said. "That's it." "It's harder than it looks," she said. "Most things worth doing are." They worked in companionable silence for a while. The rain ran down the window in long diagonal lines. Thomas thought about his mother, who had made bread every Saturday morning without fail, who had said that the smell of baking bread was the only smell that made a house feel lived in, rather than merely occupied. "Can I ask you something?" Sera said. "You can ask me anything. Do you ever resent it? That everyone else moved on? Assimilated?" He continued kneading without pause, which told her he had thought about this before. "I was angry about it for a while," he said. "A long while, I suppose. When I was young. I thought it was a kind of forgetting that was also a kind of betrayal. You can't choose what to remember and what to discard without making a judgment about what's worth keeping, and I didn't trust those judgments. Still don't, necessarily. But resentment, no. Resentment is just grief that's gotten infected." "That's a very human thing to say," she said, and then looked startled by her own words. He smiled. "I hope so. I mean, I've read the literature. The psychological literature, the philosophical, the human tendency toward narrative and metaphor to process emotional states. It's well documented. But hearing it, it's," she paused. "Different from reading about it," he said. "Yes. Most things are. The bread came out right. He knew it by the sound when he tapped its underside, a hollow knock that meant the interior had risen properly, that the crumb had developed as it should. He showed her how to tell, and she knocked on it and listened and looked uncertain, and he said, "Hear that? That hollow note?" And she said she thought she did, and he said, "Well, you'll hear it more clearly next time." They ate it at the kitchen table with butter, real butter, churned from milk he received weekly from a small dairy operation 3 valleys over, one of the only such operations left on what had been restored to functioning earth, and the butter melted into the warm bread, and the smell filled the kitchen, and Sera sat with her eyes half closed, and he wondered when she had last eaten something made entirely by hand from beginning to end. Something that had required not just effort but presence. Patience, the willingness to wait. "My grandmother made something like this," she said. "My human grandmother. Once. For a ceremony, I can't remember which one. I was very small." She paused. "I didn't know what it was at the time. I just knew it was different from other food. Like it had a weight to it." "It does," Thomas said. "That's not sentiment. That's real. The process changes the thing. The Bureau would say that's subjective." "The Bureau," he said, not unkindly, "doesn't know everything." On the 4th day, she asked about death. Not dramatically. She asked it sideways, the way important questions often arrive, in the middle of something else. They were walking in the woods beyond the garden, among the oak trees that Thomas had planted 30 years ago and that were now tall enough to cast real shade, and she was asking about the trees, how long they would live, what happened when they fell, and then she said, "What do you believe happens afterward? After we die?" He walked for a moment before answering. The woods smelled of wet leaves and fungus and that mineral quality of deep soil. "I don't know," he said. "I've never been sure. I've thought about it considerably, given my situation. My wife believed in continuation, not in any specific religious form, but in the idea that consciousness is a thing the universe does rather than a thing an organism does, and that when the organism stops, the doing continues in some other form. She was a scientist. She was also completely comfortable holding that idea, which I found remarkable. And you? I'm more skeptical by temperament. I tend to think that what we are is very specifically tied to what we're made of, and when the making stops, we stop. But I hold that lightly. Does it frighten you?" He stepped over a root that crossed the path. The trees were tall enough now that their canopy closed above, and the light came through in scattered patches. "I'm 94. I've had time to make my peace with the arithmetic. What frightens me more, or frightened me, when I was younger, before I stopped being frightened by most things, was the possibility of dying without having fully been alive. Of spending all of it in preparation or in retrospect, and missing the moment itself." He paused. "That frightens me less now too. I think I've been present. I think I've paid attention." Sera was quiet. Then, "Is that a human thing? The fear of not having lived fully?" He thought about it. An oak tree ahead of them had shed a branch in some recent wind, and it lay across the path, and he stepped over it. "I think it might be a living thing, full stop. I think anything that's aware of its own ending has to grapple with the question of whether it spent the middle well. I've read enough about enough species to think that's universal." "The Bureau classifies it as a specifically human anxiety," she said, carefully. "In the literature. The Bureau," he said again, with the same gentle deliberateness, "is sometimes wrong." On the 5th day, she showed him something she had not intended to show him. It was evening, the fire lit, the day's note spread across the coffee table alongside a mug she had wrapped both hands around. She had been quieter than usual through the afternoon, and he had not pushed, having learned by now the rhythm of her attention. She needed to arrive at things in her own time, approach them sideways, the way certain animals approach water, checking for safety before committing to the act of drinking. She took out a small card from her jacket pocket. It was analog, actual physical card, worn at the corners. A photograph printed on one side. "My grandmother," she said, and placed it on the table between them. He leaned forward to look. The woman in the photograph was clearly old, not as old as Thomas, but old, with a particular composure that age grants those who have allowed it to, and she was doing something unremarkable in the photograph. She was sitting at a table, and there was a cup in front of her, and she was looking at something outside the frame, and her expression was, "She looks like she's remembering something," Thomas said. "She always did," Sera said. "She had that look. I used to ask her what she was thinking about, and she'd say, 'Oh, nothing, just old things.' I didn't understand what that meant when I was young. I thought it meant she was absent. Now I think it meant she was very much present, but present in more than one time simultaneously. "Yes," Thomas said. "That's what it's like." Sera looked at the photograph for a long moment. "She died when I was 11. She was the one who spoke to me in what she called the old language, the full Earth language, English, without any of the Union modifications. She taught me some words. I've forgotten most of them. The Bureau doesn't, they don't classify linguistic maintenance as a priority, because the base structures persist in the Union lingua variants, and," she stopped. "What words do you remember?" Thomas asked. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. She said, in a voice that was slightly different from her usual voice, slightly more careful, slightly more tender, the voice of someone handling something fragile, "Home. She taught me that word. And remember. And," she paused. "And enough." "Enough," Thomas repeated. She said those 3 words were all you really needed. If you knew where home was, and you could remember it, and you understood what was enough, she said that was the whole architecture of a human life. Thomas sat with that for a long time. The fire burned down and he added a log and the sparks rose briefly and settled. "She was right," he said. Sera looked at the photograph again and then put it back in her pocket, and Thomas noticed she did so carefully, with both hands, which he thought was a very human thing to do. On the 6th day, she helped him in the garden. He had not asked her to. She had simply appeared beside him in the morning, in old clothes she must have carried in her bag for exactly this purpose, or perhaps she had anticipated this, or perhaps she had simply looked at the garden and felt the same pull that anyone feels when confronted with something that needs doing and a spare set of hands is available. They pulled the finished tomato plants. This is one of the less romantic aspects of gardening, the tearing out of what has already given everything it had, the clearing away, the preparation of ground for what comes next. Thomas had learned to find it satisfying rather than sad, this particular task, because the earth you expose beneath the pulled roots is always richer than you expect, dark and alive-smelling, full of everything the growing season has left behind. She worked without being told what to do, which he appreciated. She watched him for the first few minutes and then mirrored what she saw, and when she made mistakes, pulling too roughly, damaging roots that should be left, disturbing neighboring plants, she corrected herself without fuss. "You're a quick study," he said. "I've been watching you all week," she said. "It would be strange if I hadn't learned anything." "What have you learned?" She stopped and sat back on her heels, as he had done on the first day, and looked around the garden with the particular attention that had grown more refined over the week. He could see it, the shift in how she looked at things. She was no longer cataloguing. She was seeing. "That it's continuous," she said. "I think I expected it to be a series of separate actions. Do this, then do this. But it's actually one long unbroken thing. The bread you made connects to the wheat your father grew and forward to the bread someone might make from seed you saved this year. The garden connects to every garden that was ever tended. It's all one gesture." "Yes," he said. "That's it exactly. Is that why you stayed? Because you didn't want to break the line?" He considered. A robin, the bird had appeared in the garden 3 days ago, drawn by the earthworms disturbed by their digging, hopped along the turned soil ahead of them, brisk and purposeful. "Partly," he said. "And partly because the line is there whether I stay or not. You can't undo that continuity. It exists. But somebody has to know it exists. Somebody has to hold it in their hands and say, this is real, this happened, this was a way of being alive." "And when you're gone," she said, quietly. He watched the robin find something in the earth and look at it with the absolute focused attention of a creature for whom the present moment is entirely sufficient. "Then it passes," he said. "That's what things do." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't want it to." He looked at her. Her face was directed at the earth she'd been working, and her jaw was set in the particular way that people's jaws set when they're trying to contain something that doesn't want to be contained. "Sera," he said. She looked up. "That's the seed," he said. "Right there. That not wanting. That's the whole thing. That's what I was hoping you'd find." That evening she did not take out her recording equipment. She sat at the table with her notebook and wrote by hand for an hour while he read by the fire, and neither of them spoke, and the silence between them had changed character so completely from that first morning, when it had been the silence of a stranger trying not to take up too much space, that it felt now like the silence of people who have lived alongside each other long enough to know they don't need to fill every moment with words. He was reading a novel. Not on a screen. An actual book, bound in cloth, pages yellowed to the color of old honey, a smell to it that was one of the smells he thought about sometimes when he imagined dying, whether these particular sensory textures would exist in whatever came after, or whether they would simply stop, the smell of old paper and garden soil and tea and wood smoke, and whether their absence would matter to whatever version of him might persist. He suspected it would. He suspected that what a person was, finally, was an accumulation of sensory experience, not their beliefs or their accomplishments or their relationships even, but the raw material of their physical existence in the world, the specific textures of their specific life. He suspected that Margaret, wherever she was or wasn't, carried with her the smell of this garden after rain. He hoped so. He had no evidence for it. He held it lightly, the way he held most things now, which was loosely enough that it didn't hurt and firmly enough that it didn't blow away. "Thomas," Sera said. He looked up from his book. "I'm going to make a recommendation," she said. "In my report." He waited. "I'm going to recommend that the Bureau delay the final classification. I'm going to argue for the establishment of a preservation program, not a museum, not an archive. A living program. Teaching. Passing on." She looked at her hands, which were still faintly stained from the garden. "I know the Bureau may not accept it. The politics are complicated. A lot of the Union's member species have an interest in considering the absorption complete, because the alternative raises uncomfortable questions about what else might have been lost. And I know," she stopped. "You know I won't be here much longer," he said. "Yes. And you're worried the recommendation isn't worth anything if the only carrier is 94 years old." "I'm saying it's urgent," she said. "I'm saying it has to happen now." Thomas set his book down. He looked at this young woman at his kitchen table, with her worn notebook and her ink-stained fingers and her grandmother's 3 words in her pocket, and he thought about lines, and continuity, and what passes and what doesn't, and what it means to hold something long enough to hand it on. "There's a box," he said, "in the back bedroom. On the shelf above the wardrobe. My wife kept it. I haven't opened it in 12 years. I'd like you to have it." She started to speak. "Don't argue," he said, pleasantly. "It's full of seeds. Tomato and squash and pepper and 3 varieties of bean and 2 kinds of basil, all heirloom, all open-pollinated, all from stock that goes back further than either of us can trace. And there are notebooks, Margaret's notebooks, with everything she knew about growing them. Her planting notes. Her weather records. Her observations on soil chemistry and companion planting, and which moon phases she swore affected germination and which she thought were nonsense. 60 years of notes." He paused. "You could grow things. Anywhere. On a station, in a contained environment, even. It doesn't require earth. It only requires attention." Sera's eyes were bright. She wasn't crying, quite, but the luminescence at her temples, which he had noticed earlier in the week brightened when she was moved, was intensifying slightly, that pale blue-green light that came from something deeper than expression. "I don't know how," she said. "You know how to start," he said. "You learned this week. The rest you'll learn by doing, and by failing, and by doing again. That's the only method. That's always been the only method." She nodded. She couldn't speak for a moment. "Besides," he said, and his voice was gentle now, the particular gentleness that belongs to people who have stopped being afraid of their own tenderness, "you already know the important words. Your grandmother made sure of that." She put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying but simply receiving something, the way you stop and put your face in your hands when a truth arrives that you weren't quite prepared for. Thomas waited. He was good at waiting. He had had 60 years of practice. On the 7th day, the morning of her departure, he made breakfast. He made everything he knew how to make, everything he had time to make, everything he had ingredients for, eggs from his 3 chickens, fried in butter. Toast from the bread they had made together. Sliced tomato from the last good ones he had saved, a deep, imperfect red, the kind that is ugly and extraordinary. Strong tea. A small pot of marmalade that Margaret had made in their last year together, that he had been saving for no occasion he could name, that had finally found its occasion. He set it all on the table and they ate, and outside the morning light was doing what morning light does in autumn, coming in low and golden through the wavery old glass, falling across the table and the food and the steam rising from the teacups, and for a moment it looked like a painting of itself, the particular quality of ordinariness that becomes remarkable only when you understand how unlikely it is that it exists at all. Sera ate everything. She ate with the appetite of someone who has worked physically all week and is also, without quite knowing it, committing the meal to memory. After, he showed her how to open the box. It was a simple wooden box, cedar-lined to protect the seeds from moisture, latched with a hook that was slightly stiff with age. She opened the latch herself and lifted the lid and looked at what was inside, the small paper envelopes, hand-labeled in Margaret's careful script, the notebooks, 4 of them, filled end to end in a handwriting that was small and precise and occasionally passionate, words underlined 3 times when she was excited about something, small sketches in the margins, dates and temperatures and observations, and occasionally, in no clear pattern, a line that was clearly personal rather than scientific. Beautiful morning, the peas are climbing, tea, brought me tea at 6 and I forgave him everything. The roses are extraordinary this year. I think it is because we had that cold snap in March. The cold is necessary sometimes, it makes the blooming mean more. Sera read that last line twice. Her temples glowed softly. She sounds like someone I would have loved, she said. Everyone who met her loved her, Thomas said. I just loved her longest. At the shuttle, she stopped and turned. He had walked her to the meadow fence. No further, he had explained. The knees weren't reliable on uneven ground anymore, which was perfectly true but was also, she suspected, a way of giving her a clear moment to leave without the business of a prolonged goodbye on the threshold. She was carrying the box under her arm. Her recorder was at her collar. Her notebook was in her bag. She looked at him across the fence and she wanted to say something that was equal to the week, something that would hold its weight, and she knew with a particular ache of insufficient language that there was no such thing, that whatever she said would be smaller than what she meant, but that you said it anyway, because the gesture of trying mattered even when the words fell short. I'll send you the report, she said, before I file it, in case you want to add anything. I trust you, he said. You don't know if the Bureau will accept the recommendation. No. But you'll make the argument. That matters. Whether they hear it is up to them. She held the box more firmly. I'll grow the tomatoes, she said. I'll send you photographs. He laughed then, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine and doesn't apologize for itself. I don't have a way to receive photographs, he said. I have a postbox at the end of the lane. If you write me an actual letter, I'll get it. A letter, she said. On paper. On paper. I don't know if I can find. You'll find a way, he said. You're resourceful. She smiled. Her temples glowed. She wanted to say, you've changed something in me and I don't know yet what shape it will take, but I know it's real. She wanted to say, I came here to close a file and instead I think I've opened one. She wanted to say, I understand now what your wife meant about the garden being the only place she could think clearly, because I can feel it already, the way this week has given me more room inside myself than I had before, and I don't know what to do with that room yet, but I'm glad it's there. She said, thank you, Thomas. He said, come back in spring. She nodded. She walked to the shuttle. She did not look back until she was at the door, and when she did, he was still there at the fence, one hand resting on the post, looking at the meadow or the sky or something beyond the visible. The way old people look when they're not looking at anything in front of them, when they're looking at the whole long accumulated thing, all the way back and all the way forward at once. The shuttle lifted without sound. Below her, the valley resolved into the shape she had not been able to see from within it. The small house with its winter garden, the roses gone to hip and cane against the porch, the woods Thomas had planted edging the meadow with their first autumn gold. The paths between the beds, worn by 60 years of the same feet walking the same routes. The smoke from the chimney. She pressed her palm against the window. Below, he raised a hand. She filed the report 40 days later, after 3 revisions and 1 complete restart. It was the longest report in the Bureau's 200-year history of species documentation. Not because she had recorded everything, she had not. Some things she had left deliberately unrecorded, because she understood now that not everything survives by being documented, that some things survive only by being done, but because she had argued, at length and with evidence and with a passion that she knew was professionally unusual but could not bring herself to suppress, that the question the Bureau had been asking was the wrong question. The question was not, is this species extinct? The question was, what is the cost of allowing it to become so? And the answer she had carried home from a small house in a valley on a restored earth, in a cedar-lined box full of seeds and 60 years of notebooks and the memory of bread and wood smoke and a man who watched the morning mist without needing it to mean anything except itself, the answer was, more than we know. More than we have calculated. More than we can afford. She planted the first seeds in the spring, in a contained growing space on the station where she lived and worked. The tomato variety was called Brandywine, according to Margaret's careful label, and it was slow to germinate. She checked every day, and then every hour, and then made herself stop checking and simply trust the process, the way Thomas had told her you had to, and when the first pale thread of green finally pushed above the surface of the soil, she sat for a long time with her hands in her lap looking at it, this small flag planted in ordinary dark earth. This claim that something was still here, still happening, still pushing upward. She wrote him a letter. She found the paper and she found the pen and she wrote it by hand, which took her 4 attempts and 2 hours, because she kept saying more than she meant to and then crossing it out and starting over, until she realized that saying more than she meant to was exactly what she should be doing, that this was the whole point, that you showed up and you tried and you said the thing even when the thing was too large for the words. She wrote about the seeds. She wrote about the light in the station greenhouse in the mornings, which was different from his light but was still light. She wrote about the bread she had made and failed and made again. She wrote about her grandmother's 3 words. She wrote, "I think I understand now what you meant by the line not breaking. I think what I learned from you is that it doesn't break as long as someone refuses to let it. And I am refusing." She wrote, "I'll be there in spring, as promised. I'll bring more paper." She addressed it, the old way, to the postbox at the end of his lane, and she sent it, and she waited, and the tomatoes grew, and the spring came slowly the way spring always does, which is to say it came suddenly one day when you were not looking, the light different, the air different, something lifted, something turned. Thomas Reed read the letter sitting at his kitchen table with his morning tea, the wavery old glass showing her the same trembling world it had shown him for 61 years, the roses coming back, the garden brown and sleeping and full of everything that would happen next. He read it twice, which was what he did with things that mattered. Then he got up, and put on his boots, and went out to the garden to see what needed doing. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.